take a slow breath and let it out. Tonight, we'll be drifting into the dim and perilous world of medieval assassins. Not the ones from the movies, but the real ones. The quiet ones. The forgotten ones. They weren't cloaked in glory. They crept silently through castle corridors, or slipped through alleyways, half shadow, half myth, and sometimes changed the course of history. Not with fanfare, but with a whisper and a blade. Now, before we ease too far into the dark, if you happen to enjoy these quiet wanderings into the past, feel free to tap the like button and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always find it calming to know who's out there, joining this gentle walk through time. Dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan to fill the silence with a soft hum. Let's begin. No one in the Middle Ages woke up and thought, "Today seems like a fine day to sneak into a nobleman's chamber and end him for a handful of silver and the luxury of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." No, becoming an assassin wasn't a dream. It wasn't a path. It was the final stop on a road that had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Most weren't mysterious warriors trained in secret mountain temples. They were desperate, commoners, disgraced fighters, former thieves with a steady hand, or just people so invisible to the world they could vanish without ever being noticed. If you had land or a title, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. But if you'd just escaped prison, had a knack for solving delicate problems, and could slip through a tavern unseen, someone might just slide a coin pouch across a table and softly speak a name. And that name? It was never cheerful. No one paid you to deal with Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was always someone with a title, too much wealth, a moat, and guards. Lots of them. The money, tempting. The job, horrifying. But by the time someone accepted it, they had already lost everything. No family, no prospects, no hope of a warm bed or a future. Certainly, no dental care. And perks? Forget it. There was no glory, no Assassin of the Month prize, no pension, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang a sign that read, "Quiet eliminations, discreetly delivered." You just kept your head down, your steps light, and your story to yourself, especially over ale at the inn. Oh, me? I sell carpets. The stains? Oh, just die. No one dreamed of this life. They landed in it, because the world had chewed them up and spat them out, in a hood, with a blade, and no one left who cared. They weren't the hero, not even the villain. They were a whisper on the edge of the page, a shadow in the corner of the tale, the kind of person that made others lower their voice and double lock their door. Let's clear up a myth. There was no secret monastery, no candlelit training with a wise old mentor, no flute music echoing through the stone halls. There was no training montage, no guidance, no motivational speech. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most weren't skilled professionals. They were barely prepared amateurs with quick feet, a decent memory, and a gift for climbing quietly without sneezing. If you had army training, well, you might know which end of the blade to hold. If not, well, stabbing came easy. Getting away afterward, with all your organs intact, that took more than talent. It took luck. Usually, just luck. There were no books, no guild welcome kits, no safety demonstrations. No one taught you how to tell if someone had a body double or where a noble kept their bedroom door. You figured it out while hanging off a windowsill, wondering if you'd just snuck into the servants' pantry again. As for poison, That was mostly trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the error. Sometimes it worked. Other times, your target just got a little dizzy and decided to hire a new chef. Sometimes, you drank the wrong cup yourself. There was no medieval poison hotline, only herbs, guesses, and the hope your stomach could take it. If fate was kind, you might pick up a trick or two from a wandering thief or a half-retired mercenary. Maybe, just maybe, an older assassin showed you how to walk without squeaking on the cobblestones. But mentoring was rare and short-lived. Assassins didn't retire. They simply vanished. Weapons training? No chance. You weren't carrying some polished longsword. You had whatever you could sneak under your cloak. A dagger lifted off a sleepy guard, a loop of cord if you were feeling creative, and maybe a little luck left in your pocket. So no, you weren't some cloaked master of the shadows, trained in a hidden mountain dojo. You were a man with rough hands, quiet steps, and an uncomfortable familiarity with back alleys and sleepless nights. Success didn't come from training, it came from surviving. You learned how to end a life, quickly, awkwardly, and then vanish before someone could sketch your face and pin it to the church door. Your education? It was brutal, practical, and offered no diploma, only bruises, scars, and the creeping realization that you were truly and entirely alone. Why become an assassin? Simple. Money, cold, clinking, heavy coins, the kind that promised food, maybe a roof, and a few nights without hunger. That was the dream. But the truth? You were paid in lies. When someone hires a killer, they aren't looking for a long-term connection. No paperwork, no receipts, and ideally, no witnesses, including you. They'd offer silver, half now, the rest later, if they were feeling generous. But later often meant after we've confirmed you didn't botch it, draw attention, leave a trail, or live long enough to speak about it. So, you'd do the job. Creep through darkness, risk everything, perhaps silence a baron in his sleep. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't elegant. It was a task, a risk, a gamble. And when you came back for your payment... Oh, yes, about that. The client vanished. Terribly sorry. Or worse, they'd try to vanish you. A blade to the belly costs less than a bonus. Even when you got paid, it never felt like enough. Not for the danger, not for the blood, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack, itchy, flea-bitten, and plagued with guilt. You got a few coins, a nod, and a reminder you were never here. And some jobs weren't even real, political traps. You'd be given a target, someone powerful, dangerous, only to find guards waiting. The real mission? To catch you. Congratulations. You just walked into an execution disguised as a payday. And if it was real, well, you couldn't exactly take your complaint to court. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for violating our unspoken assassination agreement. The only courtroom you'd see was the one where you were Exhibit A. So you adapted. Took what you could. Demanded your coin up front. Trusted no one. Not even the trembling scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did. Just not in the way you'd hoped. Being an assassin meant surviving on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So, the job is yours. The truth's been twisted. You're underpaid, overhunted, and running out of luck. Let's talk tools. Forget the fairy tales and games. No fancy wrist blades, no folding crossbows, no enchanted daggers glowing in moonlight. What you had was whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a ragged cloak without making a sound. If luck had smiled, and I mean gold coin in a dead man's boot, lucky, you had a decent dagger. Nothing shiny, nothing shaped like a serpent, just sharp, hopefully not rusty, hopefully not still sticky from the last job. Poison? It existed, but it wasn't poured with elegance into crystal goblets. Most poisons were unpredictable mixtures of herbs, minerals, and questionable ingredients, like frog bile. Some worked in minutes, others, hours. Some made the victim sick for days, then recover, grumpier than before, and now very suspicious of stew. Rope? Handy sometimes. You could climb with it, choke with it, or tie things down. But you'd better know your knots, because nothing ruined the moment like wrestling a nobleman while muttering, "Wait, does this loop go under?" Bows? Effective. If you had one. If you could shoot it. And if you weren't trying to sneak it through a guarded palace disguised as a bouquet of daisies. But let's be honest, most assassinations? Up close. Personal. Uncomfortably so. No time for elegant marksmanship. Only time for silence, speed, and hope that the blood doesn't make the floor too slippery. You didn't get second chances. If your blade snapped or disappeared into a sewer grate, you improvised. Roof tile, rusty nail, shoelace buckle with confidence, whatever worked. You carried your gear tucked away, in boots, beneath hems, or even inside hollowed-out bread, if the situation called for it. Not for convenience, not for pride, but because your weapon was your closest ally, your companion, your boss, and your only chance at retirement. There were no upgrades, no careful polishing between missions. You didn't maintain your equipment. You begged it not to betray you at the worst possible moment. Because in the end, it wasn't the weapon that did the job. It was just you, alone, exhausted, armed with a spoon and a silent prayer. And let's be clear, you weren't hired to take out some half-drunk lantern maker snoring in a back alley. No one paid you to deal with Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. Your targets were important. Your targets, they weren't simple folk. They were nobles, bishops, military leaders, sometimes even royalty. And these people, they were not easy to reach, let alone eliminate. First, the guards. Not one or two, but dozens. Well-fed, well-armored, and very alert. Some guarded the doors. Some wandered the halls. Some just stood there, stone-faced and daring you to blink. You'd spend days, sometimes weeks, memorizing patrols, timing the squeaks of each floorboard, and figuring out exactly how many steps until the asthmatic night needed to stop and breathe. Then there were the walls. Castles didn't have charming porches. They had gates, arrow slits, and courtyards designed specifically to murder unwanted guests. There were moats, cold, dark, and full of biting things. And if you didn't fall in, you still had to worry about boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description might include risk being flambéed for peeking through the wrong window. Next, the staff. Cooks, scribes, chambermaids, stable hands. All of them with eyes, all of them with ears. One strange look from you, and the captain of the guard would be alerted before you could mutter, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins didn't just fight swords, they fought whispers and gossip, especially medieval gossip, moved faster than anything else, especially when someone's neck was on the line. And then there was your target, paranoid, cautious, and with very good reason. They were surrounded by backstabbers, ambitious cousins, and 30 courtiers pretending to adore them. They never ate without a tester. They never slept without 3 locks and a hidden escape route. Some even changed rooms nightly, like a deadly version of musical chairs. So, you hear they'll be at a feast. They'll be drinking. Good, right? Not really, because so will you. And so will the guards, and the dogs, and even the jester who somehow always seems a bit too aware. And don't forget the crowd, 50 guests, mugs in hand, watching your every twitch. Just getting near your target could take weeks. You'd pose as a servant, bribe a maid, hide in barrels, and hope no one noticed the barrel had a heartbeat. When the moment came, you had one shot, one silent, clean, vanishing act. Or you'd find yourself swinging from the castle gate, wearing a sign that read, "Nice try." Now let's talk appearances. When people imagine a medieval assassin, they think of flowing black cloaks, smooth leather gloves, maybe a dramatic hood billowing in the moonlight. Reality? You looked like a goat herder with something to hide. There were no custom-tailored outfits, no enchanted cloaks, no sleek armor hidden in your sleeves. You wore whatever you could find, torn peasant clothes, a monk's robe 3 sizes too big, maybe a guard's uniform that still smelled deeply like its previous owner. The goal wasn't to look cool, it was to disappear, which, in medieval towns, meant blending in with people who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from old injuries, and scratched constantly from whatever lived in their shirts. You didn't stand out because of your cloak. You stood out because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in old cheesecloth. And masks? No, not really. There were no stylish face covers, just scraps of cloth that made you look like a plague victim, which was useful if you wanted to avoid conversation, but terrible if you needed to attend a banquet. If anyone asked who you were, you had to lie, fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I handle silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even if you made it inside, noble households weren't full of fools. Servants noticed new faces, especially the ones who dropped chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one suspicious glance away from being hit in the head with a candlestick. And if your disguise worked, congratulations, you now had to hold your cover for hours, smile, serve, and resist the urge to stare at every noble who desperately deserved a dagger. Also, wigs didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you rubbed dirt on your cheeks, squinted a little, and hoped your beard, which was glued on with honey, didn't melt. Disguises didn't protect you. They bought you time. 5 minutes maybe, before someone asked a question you couldn't answer. And if they saw through it, well, no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. And one more thing. In the Middle Ages, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team, you didn't have a sidekick, no clever friend with a crossbow, no alchemist waiting in a candlelit cave, no handler slipping you coded messages and cheering you on from the shadows. You had yourself, a rusty blade, and a deep distrust of, well, everyone. There were no guilds you could count on, at least, not any that would return your letters. If there was some secret brotherhood of assassins, you'd only hear about it from a drunk in a tavern spilling more mead than secrets. Truth was, you were more likely to meet a ghost than another assassin looking to network. Why so alone? Because in your profession, the fewer people who knew you were alive, the longer you stayed that way. Every contact was a risk. Every conversation a possible noose. Even your client, they might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning how to vanish before they spoke it aloud. Companionship? Number friends asked questions. Lovers noticed bruises, bloodstains, and the dagger under your pillow. You couldn't settle, couldn't rest. One slip-up, one person recognizing your face at the marketplace. and suddenly your life became a sprint to the nearest sewer grate. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves, smugglers. They were chatty. You were the shadow, the one people whispered about, the one who made people disappear. They feared you, or worse, they saw you as a threat, a walking danger that might bring a mob to their doorstep. No one wanted to share stew with a man who could bring torches and rope just by sitting too long. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't talk about the nightmares that came after silently strangling a corrupt bishop in the dark. If you did talk, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous. They were usually right. So, you kept your secrets and your scars and your weapons close. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed too long. You didn't give your name unless someone paid for it. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant mastering the art of vanishing, not just in crowds, but from entire lives you would never get to live. Now imagine this. You've accepted the job. You mapped your escape. You bribed the gatekeeper. You're dressed convincingly as a chimney sweep. And then, you freeze. Maybe the target turned around. Maybe their child was with them. Maybe your hand trembled, just slightly, at the wrong moment. Guess what? You're dead. Failure wasn't a slap on the wrist. It wasn't a second chance. It was public, brutal, loud, and usually involved fire, ropes, metal wheels, or devices with charming names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. One mistake meant the mission failed. Your target lived, and loudly told everyone what you tried to do. You weren't a shadow anymore. You were a name, a face, a wanted man. Your likeness, crudely sketched, now tacked to tavern doors in every town within 30 miles. And the guards you once slipped past, now they were motivated. Sometimes the danger wasn't even the target. It was the client. Because now, you were a loose end. Someone who could be captured, tortured, questioned. Someone who could talk. The very person who paid you would be the first to put out a second contract just to make sure you never got the chance. There were no do-overs, no polite apology. No. Sorry, my blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one chance. One window of silence in time. And if you missed it, your best hope was to die quickly, before anyone could ask who sent you. And failure? It came with shame. Not loud, not angry, but quiet, heavy. You didn't just fail to kill. You failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And in this line of work, perfection was survival. Anything less was like painting a target on your back and preparing your final words. And it didn't matter how many successful jobs you'd done before. No one cared about the 12 you got right, only the one you got wrong. So, you did it. The plan worked. The blade slipped between ribs, silent, sure, without a sound. The body crumpled, no screams, no alarms, just a clean drop, and a very important person who now wasn't. Congratulations. Now, run. Because success didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop, watching the city burn behind you. Success meant running through alleyways, someone's blood on your boots, and a dog already tracking your scent. There was no toast, no drink with colleagues, no calm debrief with your client, just silence and movement, and the hope that no one remembered your face. You didn't even have time to appreciate your work. The moment the blade struck, your new job became survival, escape. From guards, from witnesses, from the tightening web that began to close around you the second blood touched the floor. The city would shut down in minutes, doors barred, horses locked up, on the other side of town, checkpoints armed, and your face, or some poor sketch of it, passed from guard to guard with the helpful note, "Maybe armed," and extremely stabby. You were probably already bleeding, which meant your window of escape was closing quickly. That's why you planned ahead. Exit routes, disguises, safe houses, a boatman who owed you a favor, or at least didn't ask questions, because the city hated scandal and reacted with iron and fire. And what about the client, the one who promised payment? Assuming they ever intended to pay you, they wouldn't be waiting at a cozy little tavern with warm bread and a thank you note. They'd disappear too, because a killer who just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places others only whispered about. So even in victory, you walked away with coin in one hand and a bright, shining target on your back. And what did you win? A week of sleeping in haylofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you blended in with a group of monks heading east. Because success didn't mean peace, it meant starting the game over, in a new city, under a new name, with even more eyes quietly hunting you. You got the kill. Well done. Now, run like your life depends on it. Because it does. And if that wasn't miserable enough, you were poor, hunted, sleeping in goat-scented corners, you also had to endure the charming paranoia of medieval society. You weren't just feared, you were cursed. At least, that's what people believed. To the average villager, you weren't simply a man in a hood. You were a walking curse, a demon's servant, someone who probably whispered to shadows and stirred toad guts beneath the full moon. How else, they asked, could you move unseen? How else could you vanish like mist at dawn? Logic wasn't terribly popular in those days. But superstition? Oh, that was thriving. Some swore assassins could change shape. Others believed you could only be seen if sprinkled with holy water. There were stories about forest spirits granting you the power to breathe death through walls. Walk through a village, and you might hear someone mutter, "Don't look him in the eye. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were suspicious. That dagger you carried, surely forged in some cursed forge deep beneath a haunted hill. And poison? That wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft, mixed by moonlight, stirred with a bone, and whispered over in languages meant never to be spoken aloud. You'd think that fear would help you, that people might keep their distance. But fear often turns to rage. Superstitious mobs don't pause to think. They grab stones, they light torches, they scream things like, "Burn him before he summons lightning." You became everyone's explanation for everything. A man choked on a chicken bone? Clearly, you were involved. Someone fell off a ladder? Must have been you. The Shadow Man. Just being in the same village as a mysterious death was enough to get hunted, which meant you never stayed long. If you lingered, sooner or later, a priest would ring a bell, and 5 angry farmers would come marching with pitchforks and purpose. And if you happened to be carrying anything even slightly odd, herbs, foreign coins, a different accent, that's all it took. "Witch!" they'd cry. "Burn him!" In a world where people believed monsters walked in human form, being too quiet, too clever, too fast, made you a threat. And threats, in medieval logic, had to be removed, swiftly, and preferably on fire. Ah, poison. The assassin's silent art. Clean, elegant, no blood, no noise, just a sip, a stagger, a final sigh, and then silence. That's the theory. In reality, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was more like entering a bar fight armed only with herbal tea and nervous energy. There was no cyanide, no sleek little capsules labeled quick death. You had plants, fungi, minerals, sometimes a toad if you were feeling ambitious. You'd gather, grind, whisper a prayer, hope. And even then, maybe, just maybe, your target got a stomachache and a renewed appreciation for food tasters. There were no precise measurements. You didn't dose people. You guessed, eyeballed it, gave it a pinch, a sprinkle, a wish, too little, and the noble just vomited and canceled dinner. Add too little poison, and your target walks away annoyed, canceling supper. Add too much, and you might start dying before the first course is even served. And let's not forget, medieval kitchens were chaos. You couldn't just stroll in and season the stew with something sinister. You had to bribe a cook, pose as one, or slip in when no one was watching, and hope you didn't run into the actual cook coming back for the salt. Worst of all, your poison didn't go straight to the noble. It went through a taster, a steward, sometimes even a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your mark was someone important, mealtime wasn't just a routine. It was a military operation. Blessings, sniffing, sampling, cross-checking the bread for suspicious crumbs. By the time food reached their plate, it had gone through more security than a royal coronation. But suppose you succeeded, you slipped it in, no one noticed, and the noble actually ate it. What happened next? Well, that depended entirely on luck. Some poisons worked in minutes, some took days. One moment they're laughing at a bad joke. The next, they're hunched over their chair, gripping the table and shouting for their astrologer. And if they survived, guess who they blamed? Not the taster, not the cook, not the dog. They blamed you. The quiet stranger, the twitchy man with a satchel full of herbs and a name that sounded a little too foreign. So no, poisoning wasn't elegant. It was unpredictable, dangerous, and messy in ways that steel never was. And if you were caught, there was no quiet cell, no neat trial. You were tortured, questioned, forced to confess to poisoning everyone from the Duke to the chicken. Now, you might imagine, if you changed the course of history, removed a tyrant, silenced a corrupt bishop, or stopped a war before it started, someone might remember your name. But they didn't, because you were an assassin, and assassins weren't meant to be remembered. At best, you became a whisper, a rumor, the foreigner with cold eyes, the man who never finished his ale. You could have pulled off the greatest political move in a generation and still ended up as nothing more than a footnote. Mysterious death, the record would say. Unexplained incident. And that was the point. Your client didn't want glory. They wanted distance. The fewer people who knew your name, the safer they were, and the less likely they were to end up poisoned by their own shadow. So, your name? Buried the moment the job was done. If you even gave them a real one. You didn't sign your work. You didn't keep mementos. You didn't exist outside the moment of the strike. And if someone did know who you were, that was a loose end. And loose ends rarely lived long. Forget honor. There were no medals for silence, no ballads for the man who stopped a war with one blade in the dark. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You got a box, or a hole in the ground. If things went poorly, a spike, labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was only remembered so it could be cursed. A warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes. And the man who did it? Gone. Like fog at sunrise. That was your legacy. Not fame. Not fear. Just absence. You weren't meant to leave a mark. You were meant to disappear. And if people remembered you, that meant you had stayed too long, and that was fatal. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered, assassins were erased. So let's say you survived, you finished the job, you even got paid, which in itself was a small miracle. Now what? You lay low, stay quiet. Trust that the client will keep your secret. Right? Wrong. Because in this profession, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the one holding the coin purse. Whether they were a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very flexible ethics, they didn't hire you out of admiration. They hired you because they needed something unpleasant, something permanent, and you were the sharpest edge in reach. But once the work was done, you became a threat, a risk, a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted whom gone, when, why, and how much they were willing to pay for it. And that made you dangerous, not just to your target, but to the one who hired you. So what did they do? They disappeared, denied ever meeting you, or worse, they sent someone else after you, a cleaner, to tie off the contract with something much sharper than a quill. In some cases, they hired two assassins, one to do the job, the other to eliminate the first right after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared to blackmail them, threaten exposure, that was bold. And also, your final mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't bargain with men like you. They buried them. If your client had honor, and that was rare, you might get paid and be left alone. But even then, you'd always wonder, who was watching from afar? Who was memorizing your gait, noting which hand you used to hold your drink? You were a secret that couldn't speak, a shadow that couldn't settle. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because if you could kill once, you could kill again, and no one wanted to be your next job. Let's imagine you beat the odds. Somehow, you survived the contracts, the poisons, the betrayals. You outlived enemies, employers, even your own conscience. So now you retire? Of course not. Assassins in the Middle Ages didn't retire. There were no farewell banquets, no seaside cottages, no pension paid in coins and quiet admiration. You didn't fade into peace. You vanished. Or you died. Often both. Even if you walked away, your past didn't. Too many secrets in your mind. Too many names on your tongue. Too much blood on your hands. No one wanted you retired. They wanted you forgotten. And forgotten usually meant buried. And even if no one came for you, and that was a big if, you still lived in the shadow of what might come. A young assassin, eager, ambitious, told to find a ghost, a whisper who used to be someone dangerous. So, you changed your name. Again. Moved to a village where no one asked too many questions, faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once guarded a noble's door. But even then, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds, sat where you could see every entrance. You kept a dagger hidden beneath the floorboards, next to a pouch of silver you never touched. It still smelled like the man you earned it from. And truth be told, you didn't trust yourself anymore either. Years of silent kills and narrow escapes had rewired your mind. Every knock at the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might have known. You stopped dreaming. Dreaming was dangerous. You stopped loving, stopped laughing, stopped breathing too deeply. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. 'Cause the truth was, there was no ending for a medieval assassin. No closing chapter, no safe haven, no happy epilogue. Just a slow, quiet fading into nothing. moving from place to place until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now you've likely understood. Being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't mysterious, wasn't noble, certainly wasn't glamorous. It was short, grim, thankless. A trade wrapped in silence, paid in blood, followed by a crowd who all wanted you dead. You wouldn't last, not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd begin with the wrong idea, that you'd be composed, cloaked, in control, a whisper in the night. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from a rope around your neck. You'd slip into a new town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover your target has moved. The guards are drunk, but suspicious. And the stable boy you paid for information, he just sold you out for a tankard of ale and a crust of bread. You freeze at the wrong moment. You strike the wrong man. You get spotted by someone's maid, someone who remembers your face from the chapel weeks ago. Suddenly, you're no longer a shadow. You're a problem, so you run. But you're not built for medieval terrain. The mud, the uneven cobblestones, the never-ending chickens in the road. You slip, you fall, and you're tackled by a guard named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for someone to take it out on. And let's say you survive that. Somehow. Then comes the aftermath. No allies, no honor, no future, just whispers, paranoia, and the quiet realization that even if you succeed, even then, the best you can hope for is to die alone. Old, forgotten, hiding under a borrowed name in a village where people still believe in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And perhaps you shouldn't even try. Because the life of a medieval assassin wasn't cool. It wasn't cinematic. It was a cruel machine that chewed through people and spat out nothing but shadows. It offered power, but never peace. Purpose, but no place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question, because no one even remembered you were there to begin with. Now, let us leave the shadows behind. Let's step into the flickering torchlight of ancient ritual and prophecy. Before she was the feared queen of Macedonia, she was known simply as Myrtale, a princess of the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed bloodlines traced all the way back to Achilles himself. Whether that was truth or legend, one thing was certain. This was not a woman meant for the sidelines of history. From a young age, Myrtle was shaped not just by politics, but by mystery, ritual, and the old gods. She didn't smile politely while embroidering tapestries. She was drawn to serpents, omens, and the trance-like ceremonies of Dionysian cults, where women danced barefoot in moonlight and summoned the divine with cries and fire. Her connection to the gods wasn't something she claimed. It was something she became. According to ancient sources, likely penned by men equal parts frightened and fascinated, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers. Some said they even coiled beside her as she slept. Was it true? We'll never know. Maybe it was slander, maybe it was myth, maybe it was magic. But it stuck. To her allies, divine. To her enemies, dangerous. Her power didn't begin in a throne room. It began in the shadows, in torchlight, among whispers, and winding serpent bodies. She was not just a princess, she was a living oracle. So when Philip II of Macedon, brilliant, brutal, and famously insatiable, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a sacred initiation, he didn't just meet a noble woman, he met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even a love story. It was a collision, a storm of prophecy and power. Some said lightning split the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. Whatever the truth. From that union came a child, a boy named Alexander, and from the moment he drew breath, Olympias was ready to shape the destiny of a conqueror. Their marriage was no storybook tale. It was built on ambition, on paranoia, on celestial signs and political fire. Philip collected wives like a warrior collects trophies, but Olympias, she built courts of her own, alliances of her own, and turned to oracles to divine not just his future, but perhaps his end. And when Alexander was born, it wasn't just a royal event. It was myth. It was omen. It was legends say Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb, and that flames danced around her child without burning him. Philip, too, had visions. He claimed to see her womb sealed by a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they truly believed these visions, or simply needed to believe them, one thing is clear. They acted as if their son was not meant to rule a kingdom, but the entire world. And yet, as Alexander's star rose, the cracks in the royal marriage widened. Olympias, once myrtle, resented Philip's many wives, but none stung more than Cleopatra Eurydice, a young, native-born Macedonian bride whom Philip married later in life. This wasn't just another woman. This was a threat, because if Cleopatra bore a son, he would be Macedonian through and through, pure in the eyes of the nobles, a challenger to Alexander. Olympias saw it clearly. The palace wasn't a home, it was a battlefield. And she would use every snake, every dream, every rite and whisper to ensure her son wasn't just remembered, but crowned. By the time Alexander reached his teens, the palace in Pella was no longer just a court. It was a war zone, veiled insults, shifting loyalties, bitter rivalries in the candlelit halls. Olympias wasn't just fighting for power, she was fighting to survive. She knew the palace was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip began to drift. More campaigns, more wine, and worse. He listened more and more to his Macedonian advisors. Then came the final insult. Philip married again. Cleopatra Eurydice, not the Egyptian queen you know, but a noble Macedonian girl, barely more than a teenager. Her uncle, Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympias, this wasn't infidelity. This was a declaration of war. The wedding feast was a disaster. Attalus, loud with drink, mocked Olympias and Alexander, questioning the boy's paternity. Was he truly Philip's son? Or was he, as Olympias claimed, the child of a god? It was meant to humiliate. But Olympias, she embraced the myth. Let them whisper. Let them believe. If Alexander was touched by Zeus, he became untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias left Macedon entirely. She returned to Epirus. But her exile? That wasn't surrender. It was strategy. In her homeland, she was still royalty, still feared, still powerful. There, she could gather allies, send letters, and watch the rot spread in Philip's palace from afar. She didn't need to be present to be dangerous. Then came the shock. Philip II, on the eve of invading Persia, was assassinated. At his daughter's wedding, in front of nobles, soldiers, and guests, just as he was about to crown himself something greater than king. He fell, and the whispers began. Was it the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it political intrigue? A rival faction? Alexander? Or was it Olympias? No one dared say it aloud, but many believed it. Because within days, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant child were dead. Murdered, they said, by Olympias herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. While others hesitated, gripped by grief and confusion, Olympias moved, quietly, brutally, without pause. First, Cleopatra, not just killed, erased. The accounts vary. Some say she was forced to hang herself after watching her infant murdered. Others say the child was thrown onto a funeral pyre. But one thing is agreed upon: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many royal mothers did not. In a palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how small, is a future war. Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra Eurydice and her bloodline erased, the battlefield had cleared. There were no more rivals, only her son's future. Alexander, still a teenager, bold, brilliant, shaped by Aristotle himself, was declared king without real resistance. But don't be fooled. It wasn't just his charm or his father's name that secured the throne. It was Olympias. She knew exactly which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She didn't just protect Alexander's rise, she designed it. Alexander didn't always approve. He was said to disapprove of the violence toward Cleopatra's family. But he didn't stop it. Because deep down, he understood what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedon, bloodlines were both blessing and curse. With her son crowned, Olympias stepped back from public view, but not into silence. This was no retirement, only a shift, from sharp action to sacred influence. As Alexander prepared to conquer Persia, she stayed behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the guardian of his destiny. She sent him relics, consulted oracles, performed rituals in his name. To Olympias, this wasn't mere warfare. It was prophecy, written in flame and sacrifice. And as long as she lived, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would disrupt that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had cleansed the palace. Now, she would protect the empire. From behind the curtain, with teeth bared. As Alexander marched east, Olympias remained in Macedon, a queen without a throne, but not without power. Officially, the regency was given to Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted men. But Olympias refused to be sidelined. She wrote letters. Often. They weren't affectionate notes. They were briefings, laced with warnings, ritual language, and carefully veiled threats. And Alexander read every one. She reminded him who his enemies were. She questioned his companions. She scolded his fascination with Persian dress, his foreign wives, even his growing obsession with being called a god. No one else dared to say these things. But Olympias? She had never been afraid to speak as both mother and priestess. Back in Macedon, Antipater grew resentful. Olympias undermined him, publicly, relentlessly. She stirred opposition through her status, her divine connections, her family in Epirus, her reach in Thessaly. She spread rumors like wildfire, and with Olympias, a whisper was often deadlier than a sword. Her letters to Alexander grew more urgent. She painted Antipater as another Philip, a traitor in waiting. Did she believe it? Perhaps. Or perhaps she simply feared being forgotten. Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to hold Greece together while he carved an empire in Asia. And so, the rift deepened. Olympias watched, waited. But behind her priestess robes, a fire smoldered. She hadn't survived the wars of the court just to be ruled by an old general. And as Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to India, She began to see the cracks forming. He trusted too many foreign advisors. He was drifting from her, from the gods, from the divine path she had envisioned. She believed his strength came from divine favor and from her. If he forgot that, Olympias knew how to remind kings who they were, even if that king was her own son. Then the news arrived. A whisper, not a trumpet. Alexander was dead. In Babylon, 323 BCE. For Olympias, it was not just the death of a son. It was the end of the world she built. Her boy, the storm she had summoned, shaped, and loosed upon the world, was gone. And he left behind no heir, no chosen successor, only chaos. The empire he carved was already breaking apart. His generals, the so-called successors, were dividing it up like jackals circling a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon, still watched her with suspicion. And now, even her daughter, Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals, each one hoping to marry into the bloodline of a god. Olympias saw it clearly. Civil war was no longer a threat. It was already here, and once again, she would have to act. But this time, she had no son to fight beside her, only memory and fury and fire. What Olympias had now was his blood, Alexander's son, a child, barely old enough to speak, born of Roxana, the Bactrian princess his father had married far to the east. Still in Macedon, Roxana was vulnerable, and the boy, even more so. But to Olympias, he was not just a child. He was a symbol, a legacy, and a weapon. She moved quickly, allied herself with Roxana, claimed the infant as heir, and vowed to shield him with prophecy and fire. But the world had changed. The generals, once loyal to her son, no longer bowed to widows or mothers. They had armies now, ambitions, and old wounds that still bled. Olympias didn't flinch. She had faced snakes, kings, traitors. A few crowned warlords with stolen spears wouldn't scare her, so she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater, her old rival, died, and in his place rose his son, Cassander, a man with no warmth and no patience for the queen's games. It was only a matter of time. The coiled serpent and the ice-eyed usurper, destined to collide. Alexander was gone, but his shadow still moved, and Olympias was still waiting within it. Years after his death, while civil war cracked the empire apart, Olympias made her boldest move. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a reckoning. The regency was crumbling. Cassander was seizing power. Roxana and young Alexander were locked away, hostages in their own palace. Olympia saw the end coming, and she refused to let her grandson fade like a ghost. She struck a deal with an aging general, Polyperchon, who still carried the faded scent of legitimacy. With his backing, Olympias didn't beg. She returned to rule. When her feet touched Macedonian soil again, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers changed sides. Even enemies paused. Olympias, even now, even aged, still shook the ground with her name. Then came the vengeance. One by one, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. Philip III, Alexander's half-brother, a puppet with royal blood, was captured, executed. His wife, Eurydice, was offered the chance to take her own life. She refused. Olympias had her strangled. It was done not in haste, but with ceremony, a goddess delivering justice. Her message was clear. Only the blood of Alexander had the right to rule. Everyone else? Pretenders. For a brief moment, Olympias held the kingdom in the palm of her hand. She restored the dynasty. She silenced betrayal. She reminded Macedon what it meant to stand before a queen with nothing left to lose. But in Macedon, Power burns fast, and Cassander had not been idle. He returned with fury, his army larger, his purse deeper, his heart colder. Her allies fell away. Polyperchon faded, the tide turned. Olympias, once a storm, now stood alone, walled inside the coastal fortress of Pydna. The fire she lit had consumed the land, the smoke was thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Cassander had come to finish what his father began, but Olympias did not kneel. She did not cry. For almost a year, she endured the siege, cold, hungry, surrounded, but unshaken. Within the stone walls, she did not live as a captive. She carried herself as the mother of a god. Cassander, calculating, cold, hesitated. He knew. Killing Olympias was dangerous. Even now, Olympias wore her legend like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down felt like blasphemy. So Cassander hesitated. He offered her mercy, a promise of safety if she surrendered. But Olympias, she had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. She knew better. Still, hunger was no longer just discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke. Her soldiers laid down their arms, and Olympias, unbending, unafraid, even in the end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander did not kill her himself. That would have been too simple, too merciful. Instead, he gave her to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. And they did. They condemned her to die. But here's the twist. When the time came, no one would swing the blade. She stood tall, silent, regal, eyes fixed like an oracle staring through smoke. These were Macedonians, men who had grown up hearing her name in stories of rituals and serpents and sacred dreams. They had once cheered her son as a god in human form, and now, here she stood, old, alone, but still cloaked in myth. Not one man had the courage to end her. So Cassander sent foreigners, outsiders, men with no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And thus, Olympias was struck down, not with ritual, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful sense, and with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was quietly extinguished. But even in death, Olympias left behind a shadow. History would never forget the Serpent Queen. She died not on a throne, but in dust, unarmed, abandoned, executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It doesn't always favor those who die in silk sheets. Sometimes, it remembers those who went down hissing. Olympias was never meant for quiet history. In life, she wielded motherhood like a blade, prophecy like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of Alexander the Great. She was his architect. Without her, there is no myth of the thunderbolt-born child, no whispers of lion dreams or sacred serpents, no purging of rivals that cleared the throne for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire. She defended it with claws. Yet even among history's most ruthless dynasts, Olympia stands apart. She didn't lead armies like Cleopatra. She didn't ride into battle like Boudica. Her war was colder, subtler, a war of goblets, alliances, priestesses, and poison. She understood fear, but even more, she understood belief. She made people believe her son was divine. And maybe, just maybe, she believed it too. Her enemies called her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator. And they weren't wrong. She was all that, and more. A daughter of a brutal world that prized cunning far above kindness. She learned early that mercy was a luxury queens could not afford. In the centuries that followed, she would be reviled and revered. a villain, a visionary, but never forgotten. She haunted Alexander's legend like a ghost, always just beyond the curtain, always just out of frame. And maybe that's where she belonged. Not as a footnote in a king's story, but as a story entirely her own. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Olympia's bones turned to dust long ago, but her shadow never left history. But her legend endures, in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-born destiny, in every empire built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting. Far from the stone courts of Macedon, on a sun-bleached island called Crete, there lies a ruin that feels less like a place and more like a dream. Just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, stone corridors twist like roots. Rooms turn back on themselves. Staircases stop with no destination. You can lose your sense of direction without ever realizing it. This place is Knossos, the beating heart of Minoan civilization, and perhaps the origin of one of humanity's most enduring stories, the labyrinth and the beast that lived within it. But before it was legend, Knossos was a palace, unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, it was not just a royal home. It was a city under one roof. Nearly 150,000 square feet, over 1,000 rooms, shrines, workshops, storage halls, light wells, running water, multi-story apartments, and maybe the first flushing toilets in history. This wasn't a primitive stronghold. It was a wonder of the ancient world. To archaeologists, Knossos looks like structured chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like magic. In the early 1900s, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans dug into this lost world. And what he found astonished him. Motifs of bulls, painted, carved, sculpted in gold, symbols of power, of worship. He became convinced this was it. This was the labyrinth, the source of the myth. The layout, confusing, layered, shifting, felt like it was built to disorient. The symbols, rich, repetitive, spoke of something deeper. And everywhere, the bull. Evans even named the entire civilization after the legendary King Minos. Whether Minos was real or only myth, his name fused with these ruins, forever. But here's the twist. No labyrinth has ever been found. No underground maze, no prison, no half-man monster. What we have instead is something stranger. A palace designed to bend space, wings and loops, turns and layers, deliberately difficult to navigate. So the question remains, was the Minotaur born from these walls? Or was the palace itself the monster? Knossos doesn't offer easy answers, but it does know how to make us ask the right questions. The myth? Famous. A monstrous creature, half man, half bull, trapped in a labyrinth so complex no one who entered ever came out. Only Theseus, Athenian prince, found his way out, led by a thread and by the mind of Ariadne. But where did this story begin? The earliest versions speak of King Minos, powerful, distant, demanding tribute from Athens. 7 boys, 7 girls, sent into the dark to feed the beast born of divine punishment. The Minotaur, hidden deep below, was more than just flesh and horn. It was the shame and fury of a powerful kingdom. To the Greeks, Crete was always mysterious, rich, and frightening. The Minoans, with their ships, their rites, their art, felt almost alien. Their people vaulted over bulls and rituals. They worshipped strange gods. They built palaces like twisting poems written in stone. To a visitor from mainland Greece, Knossos must have felt like another planet. The bull was sacred. Its horns, stylized and carved, crowned rooftops and temples. And with that, the ingredients of a legend began to stir. But what if the Minotaur was not just a monster? What if it was a metaphor? Some scholars believe the myth reflects a memory of Cretan dominance over Athens, a time when tribute wasn't fiction. In that view, the labyrinth becomes a symbol of political submission, and the Minotaur, the terrifying force behind Minoan rule. Others go deeper, inward. They say, the labyrinth is the mind, the Minotaur, our buried instinct, our primal urges, and Theseus, the part of us brave enough to walk into the dark, led only by the thread of memory. Still, no matter the interpretation, the myth remains tangled with Knossos. We may never find a literal monster, no Ariadne, no underground maze. But the palace itself, confusing, echoing, layered, is the closest thing we've ever found to a real labyrinth. But perhaps it wasn't just a myth echoing through history. Perhaps it was history longing to become myth. Long before Athens built her marble temples, before Sparta sharpened her spears, there was Minoan civilization, one of the earliest advanced societies in all of Europe. They didn't rule through conquest. They ruled through beauty, through art, architecture, and trade that reached far across the ancient world. At the center of it all stood Knossos, not a fortress, not a castle, but a palace that breathed, a maze of rooms, corridors, light wells, and stories. The Minoans flourished from around 2600 to 1400 BCE. Based on the island of Crete, they stretched a web of trade across the Mediterranean to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and even the distant shores of Iberia. Their ships cut the sea like arrows. They traded pottery, saffron, bronze, and luxury for knowledge, power, and respect. They didn't build massive armies. They built relationships. And that, more than any blade, made them rich. But perhaps what is most striking is how different the Minoans were from the Greeks who followed them. Their art celebrated life, nature, movement, not war, not punishment. Frescoes showed dolphins in motion, young dancers mid-leap, and athletes vaulting over bulls in ritual grace. Their goddesses, unapologetically powerful, bare-chested, serpent-bearing, symbols of transformation, protection, and rebirth. And in the middle of it all was Knossos, not perched on a hill, not fortified by walls, but nestled in a fertile valley, open, confident, alive. No massive defenses were needed. Either they felt safe on their island, or they projected enough power to keep threats far away. Their confidence was architectural, multi-story buildings, columned courtyards, stone stairwells and water channels curved into place like veins beneath stone skin. This was not primitive. This was elegance. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Minoans left behind no deciphered words. Their writing, linear A, remains silent, unread, untranslated. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know their prayers, or their kings, or what truly happened behind the walls of Knossos. We have only their ruins, their art, and their influence, absorbed by the Mycenaeans, echoed in Greek myths, whispered in stories of gods, bulls, and mazes. The Minoans were more than builders. They were architects of mystery. And Knossos? It wasn't just a palace. It was a heartbeat in stone. It shimmered like sunlight on the Aegean, and then it vanished. But some say its echo still wanders the halls. To walk through Knossos is to walk through time, layered, confusing, beautiful. The scale stuns you, but it's the design that holds you. Rooms lead to rooms, hallways spiral, staircases vanish into dark silence, or burst into sudden light. Nothing moves in a straight line. It's not hard to see why ancient visitors might have whispered the word labyrinth. Knossos was not just a palace, it was a living organism, an enormous, stone-bodied dream designed to move you. Spanning 150,000 square feet, the complex contained over 1,000 chambers, some no bigger than closets, others grand ceremonial halls. Every room had purpose: workshops, shrines, apartments, storage rooms lined with massive jars once filled with oil, grain, saffron, all of it wrapped around a central courtyard, where it's believed public rituals and bull-leaping displays took place. The palace was multi-leveled, up to 4 or 5 stories in places. Its engineers used the land itself, natural slopes, terraced platforms, to build a place that bent light and wind. To navigate it without getting lost, you'd need memory, instinct, or a thread. Yet beneath this seeming chaos was brilliance. Passive ventilation cooled rooms with clever air shafts. Rainwater was funneled through clay pipes and flushed away. Long before Rome made it famous, the Minoans had working toilets. One of the most iconic places is the so-called throne room, an alabaster seat carved into the wall, flanked by benches and watched over by frescoes of griffins, mythic guardians, or perhaps mirrors of the queen herself. Was it a king's seat? A sacred court? A goddess's chamber? We don't know. And the walls? They speak in color. Dolphins swim above bathtubs. Women in flounced skirts and bare chests twirl through painted scenes. Youth leap bulls, mid-air, forever captured in flowing lines. This wasn't decoration. It was identity, natural, lyrical, connected to sea and soil. And still, the deeper you go, the more Knossos begins to disorient. Some parts seem intentionally complex, not chaotic, but deliberately confusing. Maybe that's the true root of the labyrinth legend. Not a prison for monsters, but a palace that felt alive. A building that didn't trap you, but transformed you. One that inspired awe, invited ritual, and stirred just enough fear to make you question what waited around the next bend. There were no locked cells, no half-man beasts, just a place so unlike anything else, it became myth simply by existing. Knossos wasn't merely an administrative center. It wasn't just a royal residence. It was a place of worship, an architectural expression of the Minoan soul, steeped in ritual, symbolism, and quiet divine presence. Unlike later Greek temples, there were no towering columns to Zeus, no marble shrines to Athena. The sacred was woven into the stone itself, shrines tucked into corners, pillars rising like silent sentinels, stylized bullhorns appearing on rooftops, altars, doorways. Everywhere you looked, the bull, a creature not feared, but revered. The bull-leaping fresco, famous, fluid, was not just art, it was sacred theater. Young men and women vaulting over a charging bull, a dance of danger and grace, a ritual act, not sport, not spectacle, an offering, a rite, a triumph over chaos. Then, in the storerooms beneath the palace, the snake goddesses, figurines small in size but immense in presence, bare-breasted, arms raised, snakes coiled in each hand or wrapped around their bodies. They radiated power, not submission, not silence. They were guardians, symbols of fertility, of protection, of renewal. To the Minoans, snakes were sacred, creatures of both earth and underworld, alive with mystery. The spaces they were found, quiet rooms off bustling halls, hint at personal shrines, household rituals, private sacred corners where the divine was close, combined with the horns, the frescoes, the winding corridors. Knossos begins to feel like something else entirely. a ritual machine, a structure built not just for living, but for connecting with the divine. There was no central temple because the palace itself was the temple. Its layout, its light, its architecture, all part of a worldview where sacred and everyday were never separated. A corridor was a passage to the gods. A chamber's echo might once have carried a whispered prayer. Knossos didn't just house royalty, it housed gods, and for centuries it stood, a beacon of elegance, ingenuity, and spiritual sophistication. But then, something happened. Something sudden. Something no one can fully explain. By around 1400 BCE, Knossos was abandoned. Its frescoes left to fade, its courtyards emptied, and the Minoan civilization, once ruler of the seas, vanished like mist over the Aegean. What happened? Some point to nature. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted. One of the most violent explosions in recorded history. The blast may have sent tsunamis crashing into Crete's northern coast. It devastated harbors, flooded farmlands, and choked the sky with ash. The sun dimmed, crops failed, climate shifted. Knossos itself wasn't destroyed, but something shook loose. Something deep. Economies faltered. Faith trembled. Perhaps even the gods fell silent. Others point to war. By 1450 BCE, a new force had risen. The Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks with different gods, different weapons, and sharper ambitions. They may have invaded Crete in the wake of disaster. Archaeology tells us that Knossos was reoccupied. Briefly. But the culture was not the same. The art became more martial. The flowing grace of bull dancers and snake goddesses was replaced by harder lines and harder stories. Linear A, the Minoan script, gave way to Linear B, the language of Mycenaean scribes. The palace that once sang with painted dolphins and sacred rituals, now whispered in a foreign tongue. Some scholars believe the Mycenaeans didn't invade in a single conquest. They seeped in, first through trade, then through influence, and finally, rule. Others argue that the fall came from within, through civil unrest, elite failure, or spiritual collapse. What's most striking is the absence of violence in the ruins. No charred skeletons, no shattered barricades, no signs of battle. Knossos didn't fall with a scream. It fell with a whisper. The great palatial system simply stopped. The rooms went quiet. The rituals ended. Nature crept back in. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already ancient myth, a memory, wrapped in stories of kings, monsters, and mazes. And maybe that's fitting, because what ended Knossos wasn't just fire or war. It was time, and the way all beautiful things eventually sink beneath the weight of newer empires. But the bones remain, and if you listen carefully, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos lay buried under Cretan soil, its name forgotten, its walls swallowed by olive groves and dust, until one man decided to chase a story. His name was Sir Arthur Evans. In 1900, armed with passion, imagination, and a flair for drama, Evans bought the land that covered the ruins. Local farmers had been turning up strange artifacts, seals, jewelry, fragments of something vast. Evans began to dig. What he found would rewrite history. A palace, a maze, a civilization far older than classical Greece. Evans became convinced this was the labyrinth. The myth had roots, and they were buried beneath his feet. He named the people Minoans, after the mythical king Minos. He pieced together the past not just through excavation, but through interpretation. He reconstructed frescoes, rebuilt walls with concrete and vision. To some, He was a genius. To others, a vandal. Because what you see today at Knossos is both ruin and reconstruction, part ancient, part Edwardian dream. Still, Evans did something bold. He brought Knossos back to life. He gave Europe a glimpse into a Bronze Age world filled with elegance, mystery, and silence. He unearthed Linear A, still unreadable to this day, and opened questions that remain unanswered. He didn't just excavate stone, he resurrected a myth, and in doing so, he reminded the world that behind every legend is something real, something strange, something human. Knossos had slept for 3,000 years. Evans rang the bell that woke it up. To walk through Knossos is to walk through a language of symbols, frescoes, carvings, painted patterns, and horned altars. But the Minoans left no Rosetta Stone. Their words remain unread. So instead of reading their minds, we must see them, in pigments, in forms, in echoes of motion. What were they trying to say? Because their art is like nothing else in the ancient world. No towering kings, no battles, just dolphins leaping, lilies blooming, birds in flight, and sacred bulls standing proud. The humans in Minoan art are alive, elegant, dancing, ritualistic. Even in scenes that hint at danger, there is rhythm, there is grace, there is beauty. The Minoans weren't chronicling conquest. They were celebrating life, cycles, seasons, perhaps even cosmic order. Their most iconic symbol, the double axe, the labres, found in shrines, on walls, etched into stone. It may have symbolized female divinity, celestial balance, a tool not of war, but of worship. Some believe the very word labyrinth comes from labrys. If that's true, then the labyrinth was never meant to be a maze, but a house of the double axe, a sacred space, not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration, stylized bull horns placed atop walls and altars. Perhaps they marked boundaries between the sacred and the mundane, and everywhere, the bull. The bull was not feared, it was revered, celebrated. The famous bull-leaping fresco is not a sport. It's sacred theater, a ritual of daring and balance, a tribute, perhaps even a communion with the divine. And the snake goddesses, figurines small but impossible to ignore, arms raised, chests bare, serpents curled around arms and necks. They radiate confidence, power, mystery. They were not passive idols. They were guardians, symbols of fertility, of transformation, of protection. Snakes, creatures of both the earth and the underworld. The rooms where they were found suggest something deeply personal. Ritual corners in a palace that pulsed with life. All of it, the frescoes, the horns, the labyrinthine halls, feels like more than architecture. Knossos wasn't just a palace. It was a living ritual. There was no temple at its center because the palace itself was the temple. Walls were prayers, halls were processions. Every echo was once a whisper to the gods. And then, quietly, it vanished. No battle, no blaze, just silence. And when it fell, the memory did not. The Greeks turned it into legend, a tale of mazes, of monsters, of a boy with a thread and a woman with a name that still lingers in myth. Maybe the labyrinth was never a prison. Maybe it was a story, not carved into scrolls, but into stone. A narrative you walked as much as told. A myth that invited every generation to try and make sense of a place that was never meant to be solved. We made it archaeology. We built timelines and theories. But Knossos refuses to explain itself. It leaves you with questions, feelings, a thread to follow. Because Knossos isn't just a ruin, it's a question. And like Theseus, we are all still following the thread. It wasn't just the front gate that battering rams targeted. They were aimed at weak spots, at thin walls, watchtowers, and joints in the stonework that split under pressure like stale bread. Their arrival meant only one thing: surrender, or be broken. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. Roman engineers built enormous rams, called Ares, Latin for ram, suspended by chains or ropes inside massive siege shelters. Some were so large they required dozens of men to move. The rhythm of their swing was said to sound like thunder rolling across stone. But rams didn't work alone. They required coordination. Crews had to keep the beams swinging in sync while under fire from above, burning pitch, stones, spears, boiling oil. If the ram stopped, it died. But when it moved, truly moved, it was unstoppable. Wooden muscle versus human masonry, ancient physics, weaponized. And that was just the beginning. If the battering ram was the brute, the catapult was the tactician. Where rams smashed at the gate, catapults attacked from a distance. And they didn't just launch stone, they launched dread. They were the first real artillery in military history. They revolutionized sieges by turning gravity and tension into terror. The first catapults emerged in the Greek world around the 4th century BCE, born from the mind of Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse, who loved cutting-edge violence. He commissioned the first torsion-powered machines, devices that stored energy in twisted ropes made from animal sinew or hair. These weren't slingshots for giants. They were instruments, precise, cold, unnerving. Two types soon evolved: the ballista, a massive crossbow that launched bolts; the catapult, which hurled stones, flaming pitch, or worse. Then came the Romans, masters of adaptation. They never met a Greek idea they couldn't improve. They built catapults that broke down into pieces, packed onto carts, reassembled at siege camps like deadly puzzles. Some could fire 60-pound stones with enough force to tear through gates, battlements, and soldiers alike. But catapults weren't just about destruction. They were about spectacle. They sent messages, sometimes literally. Corpses, severed heads, diseased bodies, all launched into cities not just to kill, but to crush morale. In one chilling account, a besieging army used its catapults for biological warfare, spreading plague with every arc of rotting flesh. Catapults had limits, of course. They were heavy, hard to move. They required trained crews and favorable terrain. But when set up properly, they turned cities into targets. For the first time in history, thick stone walls didn't just have to resist the ram. They had to survive the skies. 'Cause now, destruction came flying. But if catapults were clever, the trebuchet was majestic, tall, lumbering, groaning with weight. It wasn't just a machine, it was a statement. It said, "Your walls mean nothing." Unlike its tension-powered cousins, the trebuchet ran on gravity. At its heart was a simple idea: a long wooden arm mounted on a sturdy frame. On one end, a heavy counterweight. On the other, a sling. Raise the weight, let it fall. And the arm swings, whipping the sling and hurling a massive payload over enemy walls in a high, arcing path of doom. Controlled, predictable, devastating. The earliest version can be traced back to China, as early as the 4th century BCE. Back then, they were traction trebuchets, powered not by weights, but by men. Dozens of soldiers pulling ropes to spin the arm. The counterweight trebuchet, the version that would change siege warfare forever, emerged around the 12th century. Its roots are debated, perhaps Byzantine, perhaps Islamic. But once Europe got its hands on the design, it spread like fire through castles and crusades. Its power was breathtaking. A well-crafted trebuchet could launch a 300-pound stone over 300 meters. Stones the size of furniture came crashing down on towers, supply depots, and soldiers alike. But the real magic was in the arc. Unlike catapults, trebuchets didn't just strike the walls. They soared over them. They hit what was hidden. Courtyards, barracks, warehouses, hope. And it wasn't just stone. Trebuchets launched. Diseased animals burning pitch pots of lime to blind defenders, even notes or insults, wrapped in cloth and tied to rocks. One legendary story comes from the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. The English built a trebuchet so massive, named Warwolf, that the defenders surrendered before it was even fired. The king refused their surrender because he wanted to see it work. That was the trebuchet. Not fast, not sleek, but unstoppable. It took hours to construct, minutes to reload, and a team of skilled engineers to maintain. But when the counterweight dropped, cities held their breath. While the rams smashed gates and catapults rained fear from afar, the siege tower rolled right up to your front door. A mobile fortress, a wooden skyscraper on wheels, covered in wet hides to resist fire, bristling with spears and archers. The ancient equivalent of an armored troop carrier and a nightmare with wheels. Once you saw it coming, you knew the real fight was about to begin. Siege towers were bold. They were loud. They were meant to terrify. The Assyrians may have built the first, but it was the Hellenistic Greeks who scaled them to extremes. In 305 BCE, during the siege of Rhodes, Demetrius of Macedon constructed a 9-story siege tower. They called it the Helepolis, the taker of cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, equipped with catapults, shielded in iron plates, and pushed by thousands of soldiers. It also collapsed under its own weight. But its ambition? Unmatched. Siege towers solved one problem: walls. They created elevated platforms so attackers could walk onto your battlements from above. From the top, archers rained down death. From below, troops prepared to board the walls. But these towers weren't invincible. They were slow. They got stuck in mud. And they were prime targets. Defenders hurled fire, rolled boulders, flooded the land, or built counterscarps. Inner walls and ditches to break a tower's advance. Still, when they worked, they were devastating. A hole in your wall was one thing, but a siege tower spitting soldiers onto your ramparts, that was chaos. It turned the siege into a vertical race. Height became an advantage and a risk. Because once the gangplank dropped, there was no turning back. It was time for hand-to-hand hell. But not all siege weapons made their mark above ground. Some of the most devastating worked below. Siege tunneling, also known as sapping, was the art of defeating a fortress by taking away the very earth it stood on. Literally, dig beneath the wall, support the tunnel with wooden beams, then set them on fire. The tunnel collapses, and so does the foundation above. One moment, your city stands tall. The next, a section of your wall crumbles like stale bread. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't dramatic. There were no thunderous impacts or flying stones. But it was lethal, slow, silent, unseen. The Assyrians were early practitioners, but the technique matured with the Greeks, Persians, and later, medieval European armies. During the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, the Spartans tried something dark. They tunneled beneath the city walls, hoping to collapse them from below. But the defenders dug back. Countermining was born. Picture it. Soldiers, underground, digging in total blackness. Hundreds of feet below the surface. No light, no sound, except for the tap, tap, tap of an enemy pick coming closer. The moment they heard it, they rushed to intercept. What followed was not glory, it was terror. Claustrophobic knife fights by torchlight, mud, blood, no room to swing, only room to survive. And when undermining worked, the results were catastrophic. At Rochester Castle in England in 1212, King John's forces tunneled beneath the southern wall. They packed the mine with pig fat, lit it, and when the supports collapsed, an entire tower came down with it. The defenders surrendered in shock. By the 13th century, siege engineers had evolved. They could measure soil behavior, pinpoint weak foundations, plan collapses with surgical precision. They were part geologist, part demolitionist, and part madman. Because if you couldn't go over the wall, and you couldn't go through it, you could always take it down from below. But not all the horror came from the outside. Defenders had their own answers, and many of them were hot. Let's begin with the worst: Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantines around the 7th century CE, Greek fire was no ordinary flame. It stuck to wood, to flesh, to water, and kept burning, even on the sea. It was sprayed from siphons, hurled in clay pots, and ignited nightmares across empires. We still don't know how it was made. The formula died with the empire, but its legend still burns. Greek fire could reduce entire fleets to charred skeletons in minutes. And if you thought that was bad, let's talk about boiling oil, or water, or sand, poured from murder holes, the openings in ceilings designed specifically to scald intruders. Hot oil was feared most. Unlike water, it clung to skin, soaked into armor, set flesh alight with no mercy. But hot sand? It was subtle, cruel. It slipped into the gaps, around the neck, under the wrists, cooking warriors from the inside out. From afar, it didn't look like much. Up close, it turned steel-hearted men into screaming wrecks. And sometimes, defenders turned to gravity. Boulders, logs, even animal carcasses, dropped from parapets onto siege engines, siege crews, siege dreams. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to break the machine and break the morale. And then came the traps, hidden pits, collapsing bridges, spiked barricades. Castles became puzzles, painful, deadly puzzles designed to confuse and delay. Because in siege warfare, delay was everything. Every hour the wall stood was another hour closer to plague in the enemy camp or reinforcements on the horizon. It was a war of attrition, a wait-and game between engineers and endurance. And while attackers had physics, defenders had creativity and a lot of boiling rage. But remember, siege warfare wasn't just about destruction. It was about domination, the mind as much as the wall. Siege weapons weren't just tools. They were symbols, massive, groaning, burning. They whispered a single idea into the hearts of those behind the walls. You are not safe. Ancient commanders knew this. The Assyrians paraded their engines in the open, dragged them across deserts with fanfare, not just to move them, but to show them, to terrify before the battle even began. The Romans built their siege camps in full view of the enemy, not out of carelessness, but by design. Let the defenders watch. Let them hear the hammers building rams, see the catapults being tested. Siege was theater, and fear was part of the script. Sometimes the payload wasn't just stone, it was a message. The severed heads of messengers, of generals, launched over the wall still wearing their armor. At the siege of Constantinople, it wasn't just rocks that fell, it was bodies, diseased corpses hurled to spread fear and plague. During the Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346, plague-infected corpses were catapulted into the city. Many believe this act helped spark the Black Death in Europe. The trebuchet was no longer just a machine. It was an announcement. Its presence was unmistakable. You heard it before you saw it. The creaking of winches, the grind of gears, the heavy thunk of the counterweight dropping, like the heartbeat of a storm. But the most terrifying sound was silence. A sudden pause meant only one thing. Something's coming. Would it be stone, flame, rot, or just the waiting? Even the sounds became weapons. The rhythmic thud of a ram, the screech of moving towers, or the hollow hush just before impact. Commanders understood this. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was despair. To make defenders believe their gods had abandoned them, that their walls were just waiting to fall. And when that mental dam cracked, the gates opened without a fight. Because in siege warfare, the mind often collapses before the masonry. But then came gunpowder, and the world changed. In the late medieval era, cannons roared onto the battlefield. A single, well-placed shot could do in seconds what a trebuchet might take hours to achieve. Stone walls, once proud, became liabilities. By the 15th century, Europe's castles were falling, not to rams or flame, but to iron and explosive force. Siege warfare entered a new phase, explosive, brutal, deafening, and yet, the bones of it all remained the same. Modern artillery still whispers thanks to catapults and trebuchets. Every ballistic missile, every howitzer is just a descendant of an ancient question. How do you break what's meant to be unbreakable from a distance? Physics, trajectory, tension, force, discovered, perfected, long before gunpowder ever arrived. Even modern military psychology, shock and awe, owes a debt. Those towering siege engines with flags snapping in the wind, they were the original shock and awe. Because siege weapons weren't just built to crush walls, they were built to crush hope. You can still see the scars. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps still climb the desert slope. At Constantinople, where ancient walls resisted machines for 1,000 years, until they couldn't. At castles across Europe, where rounded towers and angled bastions tell the story of walls constantly adapting to survive the next blow. And even now, in a world of satellites and drones, siege warfare hasn't vanished. It's just gone digital. Cities are still surrounded. But now, the walls are firewalls, the sieges are blockades, or media blackouts. But the soul of the siege, it endures. Because siege warfare was never just about breaking in. It was always about waiting, watching, wearing down. Someone wants in. Someone wants to stay safe. And both are willing to build, to burn, and to break, to win. The battering rams are gone. The trebuchets are museum pieces. But the spirit of siege warfare, it's still here, still alive, still destructive.